Dr. Siyam is going to begin by giving us his take on the normalization between the Emirates and Israel. And he will speak for a while on the subject matter, and then we will have questions from the audience. Thank you. Tfaddal, Dr. Siyam.
Okay. Yeah, I want to talk to you today about a number of issues, and I hope I'll be able to cover all those issues related to what's going on between United Arab Emirates and Israel. So I want to talk about first what is normalization, and then I'll talk about the contacts between Arab regimes and Israel. I give a brief historical background. I'll talk about why it happened now and the state of affairs in the Arab world, Palestine and Israel and the United States. Then I will ask the question, will there be other countries following the steps of United Arab Emirates? And I might have a few minutes also to say what should be done. So I'll start by saying the word normalization, it's a new jargon in the political language in the Middle East. It started some years ago, especially after the Camp David Accord. But normally, it happens between two belligerent parties when there is abnormal relations and they go into normal relations. For example, the conflict in Bosnia between the Croats, the Muslims, and the Serbs, after reaching a peace agreement in 1995, there was a period of trying to normalize the relation between these three communities. It happens between many countries, between Northern Cyprus, Southern Cyprus. It happened between Eritrea and Ethiopia when they have conflict and they go into a period of normalization. This case does not apply to United Arab Emirates. In fact, there was nothing to do with the Arab-Israeli conflict except what the country itself committed itself to. In 1972, following the establishment of the state, the country passed a law, it's called Law Number 15, which commits itself not to have any relation with Israel, not to trade with Israel, not to recognize Israel. It also joined the League of Arab States. It joined the Organization of Islamic Conference. At that time, now it's called Cooperation. It joined the United Nations, and it committed itself to all these resolutions adopted by these organizations. I just want to give you an example. In 1975, when the number of Arab countries, the Arab group, sponsored a resolution in the General Assembly to equate Zionism with as a form of racism and racial discrimination, among the sponsors to this resolution was United Arab Emirates. United Arab Emirates was among those countries who supported the Palestinians financially. They allowed many thousands and thousands of Palestinians to work there. And they've been always committed to supporting Palestinians politically, morally, and financially. In fact, I carried a mission for the UN in 1997. I met some officials from United Arab Emirates. And one of them told me, we have no problem. Our concern, all our focus is how to support the Palestinian brothers. So that is what the United Arab Emirates is deviating from. It's not because they were fighting, there was belligerency between the two countries, except this context that the United Arab Emirates had been involved with. Now I want to say that contacts between the Arab regimes, and I want you to please to pay attention that when I'm talking about Arabs, or I say the people of this country or that, in fact, I'm talking about regimes, basically, because the Arab people in general, the question of Palestine is deeply embedded in their hearts, and nothing will change the support that the question of Palestine enjoys among all the Arab peoples. Contact between the Arab regimes and Israel had never stopped, in fact, especially some Arabs. I don't want to generalize. I mean, from early 50s, There have been contact between some countries, like I don't shy away to mention some, at least Morocco, for example. They have contact between the regime and Israel. There were some cooperation in some fields. I don't want to go into details, but maybe if you will ask me in the question and answer, I will be happy to answer that. There was some contact between the regime in Jordan and Israel, but all these contacts were secret, in fact, and no one will dare to mention it. It was exposed much later, okay? And the real a little bit of open contacts happened after Egypt signed the treaty in 1979. So I want to divide the relations between Arab regimes and Israel into these three kinds of categories: secret contacts, which are kept secret, and no normalization, and then reaching peace agreements and no normalization, and now normalization without being in a state of belligerency. So that is how it went. So the first stage between Arab regimes and Israel was completely secret until after 1973 war. And the 1973 war created a new dynamics in the Middle East because there was real solidarity among all Arabs. They fought bravely in the battlefield and they stood together. They invited the PLO to represent the Palestinian. They were able to score many successes in the United Nations by passing so many important resolutions in favor or in supporting the Palestinian question, especially that resolution 3236, which talks about the rights of the Palestinians, especially the right of self-determination. But the contact between the Egyptian government and the Israelis started right after 1973, and it was hosted by Morocco. And Hassan Touhami was the contact, and he was meeting his Israeli counterpart, sponsored by King Hassan, until everything was completed. And Sadat in the parliament spoke about that he's willing to go to the end of the earth, including Jerusalem, to make peace with Israel. So everybody thought that was a surprise, but it wasn't a surprise. In fact, everything was put in details, and that's how it started. Following that Camp David, some Arab countries felt they can now reach out with a little bit of openness, not necessarily completely secret. 1986, for example, Shimon Peres was coming back from the United States back to Israel, and he stopped in Morocco openly, okay? In 1999, for example, I want to jump Mauritania, which has nothing to do with also, it's not a frontline state, recognized the state of Israel and opened an embassy. And when the foreign minister asked why is that, he said, oh, that falls within the efforts of Mauritania to solve the Palestinian question. What a joke. I mean, every regime used to do these things and claim that it's on behalf of Palestine. But again, now we go to the second stage where there are some peace agreements. It happens between Egypt and Israel in 1979, and they opened embassies, they started reaching to each other. However, it never reached the public. Grassroots Egyptians resented this kind of agreement. And the Israelis never felt free to go or visit or just invest in Egypt, maybe something secretly, but not real. Until today, the Egyptian people resent this relation, and we say with so much confidence, there is no normalization between Egyptian people and Israel. The agreement remained between the political class and Israel, and not between the Egyptian people and Israel. The second agreement happened with Oslo, 1993. I mean, these Palestine, Egypt, and Jordan, they have some some conflict with Israel. I mean, I'm not justified, but they could have an argument. They say, oh, our land is occupied and we want to get it back. So we have no guilt feeling to negotiate and bring our land back, or find some way to, what we couldn't get by force, we can get by politics or diplomacy. So then the Oslo Accord, which is, I should say, it really opened a new gate for those Arabs who want out to reach to Israel. The Oslo Accord, followed by the Wadi Araba agreement between Jordan and Israel in 1994. After Oslo Accord, many Arab countries felt now they can go through some kind of open relation. And there were at least 7 or 8 countries opened a new kind of representation with Israel. For example, there was a trade office in Doha, Qatar, in Oman, in Bahrain, in Tunisia, Morocco. So there were stuff, and that period, by the way, did not last long. And I call it transition. I mean, between the open relation and the secret relation. This period ended with the second Palestinian Intifada, which started 2000. So most of these countries closed these trade or representative offices, and if any relation left, went back to secrecy. I mean, there are a few who started, receiving some sport team or some meeting in a context of international conferences, but there was no real normalization. This agreement between Israel and United Arab Emirates is completely different. As we said, there was no war between United Arab Emirates and Israel, and it's going full scale relation, full-fledged relation, from not only just exchanging embassies, but also kind of alliance. And this relation has been going on for a long time, in fact, between United Arab Emirates and Israel. In 2015, United Arab Emirates hosted a new office for the International Organization for the Renewable Energy. And that was an opportunity for an Israeli official from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to go to Abu Dhabi and open the office. And it was like openly, it was broadcast on TV, and there was some kind of celebration. But the relation continued until we reached this agreement. Now, I want to talk about why now. What happened? I mean, this relation, which was going on for some time, secretly and openly between UAE and Israel, now it reached that level of openness. We have to look at the Arab world, and I want to speak about 4 elements, 4 variables in the Arab world: the Palestine issue, the Arab world, Israel, and the US. And there are a combination of factors that came together at this point of history that made the agreement between Israel and the United Arab Emirates possible. On the Palestine issue, I mean, the worst situation that the Palestinian can go through is what we see in now. Not only there was a major division between the 2 major groups in Palestine, Fatah, or the Palestinian Authority, and Hamas in Gaza, it's also geographical division. There's also ideological division. I mean, both governments are in a state of denial. In fact, they don't know that the public in both the West Bank and in Gaza are completely disappointed by their performance. And if there is an election that could take place now in Gaza, I assure you that Hamas will not succeed. And if there is election now, free and fair election in the West Bank, the PA will fail miserably as well. I mean, there was so much disappointment by their performance. There was so much talking about corruption, about limiting the freedom of expression and assembly, nepotism, so many things. But that is we cannot be as bad as we are going through now with the Palestinian question. On the other hand, also, if we look at the Arab world, the situation is even worse. There are wars within a state. There are at least four different, or five or six, we could say, different conflicts going on in the Arab world. Look at what happened in Yemen. Look what happened in Libya, what happening in Syria, what happened in the internal strife and conflict inside Lebanon, what happened in Iraq. And as we speak, out of the 65 million refugees, about 60% of them are from the Arab world. There are major humanitarian crises in the Arab world. Yemen is #1 in the world. And Gaza, probably the second. There are 2 million under siege for 13 years. In Syria as well, there is at least 4 million in the northern enclave of Idlib who needs help. There's about 80% of the Yemeni people need food to be coming from outside. In addition, not only to the conflict, but diseases like cholera and COVID-19 and different division fighting for different causes even. It's not one war in Yemen. In fact, multiple of wars taking place in Yemen. Same thing in Libya. Look at the polarization in Libya and the proxy war that on one hand, you have the government of national accord supported by Turkey and the other General Khalifa Haftar supported by United Arab Emirates, Egypt, Russia, and France also. So that's how the situation in the Arab world. Also in the Arab world, there is no representative government. I mean, all those, in general, all those leaders in the Arab world are imposed or coming through by military coup or supported by outside powers, and hardly you find any representative government. The exception to the rule is Tunisia, and Tunisia is facing enormous problems. And there are many outside forces who are trying to sabotage even the only democracy in the Arab world. Look what happened after the Arab Spring, after 2011. The regression of those grassroots revolution is almost complete. And Egypt is an astonishing example of what happened after at least there was some kind of election, free and fair, some kind of civilian government, but look what happened after that. So as if the Arab world is denied the right to have a representative government, a truly representative government. On the other hand, also in the Arab world, in addition to all these, is the ideology of extremism, which is becoming a kind of excuse for other forces to interfere by force. I mean, how come those terrorists from all over the world were able to come easily, for example, to a country like Syria, which gave excuse to so many countries to interfere, and having about probably 20 countries or more fighting different causes in Syria. So this ideology of extremism and terrorism and extreme ideology under the banner of Islam, that is also made the scene in the Arab world as much as we can see it now, is also an excuse for foreign intervention and denying the grassroots or movement seeking democracy, freedom, multi-party system, rule of law being denied. That is the situation in the Arab world as we see, which all reflected on the question of Palestine. It made the agenda of every country, the internal agenda is on top, and keeping the question of Palestine at the bottom of the concern of that country. Again, another coincidence, or what happened, that is, we have a government in Washington that has never been in the history of the US as much supportive of the Israeli diktats, I could call it. In fact, those who are running the foreign policy in the White House are those who are completely loyal to the Israeli radical trend in Israel, not to the mainstream Israelis. I mean, you can criticize so many policies of Netanyahu and the radicals in Israel, but maybe you cannot do it here. And those who are running the foreign policy in the US had never been so loyal to the Israeli extreme right as it is now. I mean, you can see from the very beginning, Trump recognized Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, then moved the embassy, then closed the PLO office in Washington, then stopped the financing of UNRWA, etc., and all the way to the deal of the century, which he issued on the 28th of January of this year, following the attempt of annexation, which it will not happen except with the approval of the United States, and it will happen, by the way. Okay. And the last thing of these four components that came together is the Israeli government also. Netanyahu has been ruling in Israel more than any other prime minister. And Netanyahu, if you recall, he voted against the Oslo Accord. So since he was elected the first time in 1996, he was determined to undo everything Oslo Accord did. So at least the idea of maybe possible a Palestinian state could come out, even if it's not fully fledged independent or sovereign, but the idea of reaching an agreement with the Palestinian and having some kind of entity for Palestinian that they could call a state, it was not accepted by Netanyahu. And since he was elected all the way through all these years, he was undoing everything Oslo had spoke about. Annexing more land, Judaization of Jerusalem, arming the settlers, building the separation wall, and most importantly, the definition of what is the Jewish nationality, the Jewish nationalism, or the Jewish identity of 2018, which in that law, they denied any self-determination between the River Jordan and the Mediterranean, except to Jews, which is, this is the core of what we call racism. When you give the right exclusively to one part of the population and deny it from the others. And you claim that this whole area is yours based on some mythical justification, which no one can even accept scientifically or politically either. So all these four components came together: the situation among the Palestinians, the situation among the Arabs, the government in of the United States, the government of Israel. They came, these four combinations, which made it possible for United Arab Emirates to take that bold step. But we have also to ask the question, why UAE? Why? I mean, UAE is a small country with a population of less than 1 million people, the original United Arab Emirates, the 7 Emirates. Why do they have to play a role that's bigger than them? Why United Arab Emirates now, for example, fighting a war in Yemen, and they created the Southern Transitional Council, which has its own agenda. Why they have to go to the island of Socotra and occupy it, throw out the recognized government? Why they have to have so many military bases in northern Somalia, Hargeisa? They have another one in Eritrea, in Assad. They have a number of bases in Egypt. And they have also in Aden. And they control even they lease some of the Saudi ports on the Gulf. Why they're playing this role? Why, when there was military exercises between Turkey on one hand and France, Italy, Greece, and Cyprus on the other in Eastern Mediterranean, why the United Arab Emirates jumped to join the French, Italian, Greek, and Cypriot? Some a big question. Why? And they have 3 of their islands occupied by Iran since 1971. Of course, they claim that it's because of Iran, but that is not acceptable claim. I mean, the trade between United Arab Emirates and Iran is probably one of the largest in the Middle East. They have, before Corona, they used to have 200 flights a week between Abu Dhabi, Dubai, and other airports with Iran. They have a huge Iranian community in UAE. They have trade, they have universities, Iranian universities and schools. So what is that? I mean, kind of the fear of Iran. I mean, and now they are expanding this fear to Turkey. But why Turkey? And under the slogan of this Islamic Muslim Brotherhood. I mean, as if Turkey is a Muslim Brotherhood country, which is, honestly, it's ridiculous. I mean, I don't want to talk about that because it's not our subject, but that is not. So we have to put that in perspective and see that the United Arab Emirates is playing a major role, bigger than, and it cannot do it on its own. This is a functional government. This is a country with a role to play. They cannot do it alone unless it has been debated, it has been revised, it has been approved. By who? I mean, we have to ask. I think I could leave it to you. You know who is authorizing the United Arab Emirates to expand this way. They're controlling the seaports on the Red Sea, which lead to the Israeli, which is a major Israeli trade route. And with the convincing Egypt to sell those 2 islands, Tiran and Sanafir, and this way it is separating the 2 from the Egyptian soil, making that line as international water, which they cannot, no one can tell Israel, you pass it from here or you don't, because it's international water. On one hand, that's Egyptian land, and the other is Saudi. So if the 2 sides are not owned by one country, then it becomes international water. So it is ironic that the Israeli recently disclosed they have already a military presence in the Yemeni island of Socotra. So that means the cooperation was going on for a long time. So this is the role I see that United Arab Emirates, it's not called normalization. I call it, it's alliance, basically an alliance between Israel and United Arab Emirates. And it has been going on for a long time. And the UAE did not do all these steps which they took for the last, from 2011 all the way until now, especially 2011, when the counter-revolutionaries against the Arab uprising, which we call the Arab Spring, started, which the UAE played a major role in the counter-revolutionary movements. Until today, it has been working secretly between Israel and the UAE under the auspices of the United States of America. And I think now it is coming to the public. This is what I see. It's not that is just it happened that way. It's not a surprise. They've been working for it for a long time. Now, the Palestinian, I should maybe if the time is, I'll try to finish Faisal in 3 minutes. Yes, the Palestinian is in bad shape now. I mean, they have to rethink their strategy. And their strategy should not keep repeating the same old rhetoric that we are standing and we will depend on the international community supporting us, Arab people are supporting. No, I think the change will start from the Palestinian. And if the Palestinians do not address this challenge now, it will probably be too late. And I think they should start looking at Israel as not just only an occupying power, but also 3 things, I think. First, as an apartheid state, by its own definition. Second, as an occupation power in the West Bank. And third, by a country who put Gaza under siege. So siege, occupation, and racism are the 3 elements of Israeli character as we speak. And Palestinians everywhere should highlight these three sides of Israel: the apartheid, the occupation, and the siege. And on the other hand, the Palestinians should look into their own house and re-amend this kind of division, especially. They have to have a kind of a new election, elect a new Palestine National Council, which will elect a new leadership to lead the new stage. We cannot address the future as we see it now with the old rhetoric, with the old leadership, with the old program. We cannot do that. Palestinians should be aware that is an existential challenge now. Either they stand strong and firm, or it might really come to the end of their just cause. With that, I will end my talk and take some of your questions. Thank you for listening to me. I hope I was able to address some of the issues you have in your mind. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Abdelhamid. I find your last comments quite interesting about holding elections. It appears that Palestinians are in a very difficult situation currently, and they are divided among many, many organizations. There has been some idea floated around that in order to make any progress, that Palestinians should not just start with the elections, but they need to dissolve all existing organizations, political and otherwise, and start from scratch, hold elections globally, and elect a council, and then elect a government, and that government would have authority over all Palestinians and Palestinian matters. What is the realisticness of this proposal or idea? And can you see the existing political organizations agreeing to dissolve themselves in favor of Palestinian unity?
Thank you, Faisal. I don't think they will. I mean, they just met in Beirut, 14 leaders of 14 factions who met both in person and virtual. And they came up with the old rhetoric, and they established a committee to look into how to unite. And this is the first meeting of the leaders of all 14 factions in 9 years, by the way. Okay, I don't see Abbas giving up his position, or Hamas, or any. But what the most possible thing is that they could all agree into fair and free election. That could be possible. I mean, whatever the polls, bring about, they could accept. That is maybe possible. Especially the challenge now is reaching their throats themselves. So, and if you would ask the PA, would you dissolve yourself? They would say no. How are we going to leave these hundreds of thousands of employees who are running the health system, the schools, the sewage system, the agriculture, all these, how are we going to leave them? But what it's possible to do is to change the function of the PA into making just an operational mechanism and elect the PLO. The PLO is the umbrella organization. They all agree that it is the sole legitimate of the Palestinian people. But it's incomplete because there are major groups who are not there. So if we say that we will have free and fair elections and the new leadership should be elected after a PNC, then all groups will be represented in the new leadership. And we should have like a realistic elections of PNC, not as the way it is now. We have 714 members of the PNC since 1996. Many of them passed away, many of them too old. And this is unacceptable. So we should have a tangible, an acceptable size of PNC, no more than 350, 200 from outside, 150 from inside. And this both, which is now elections is possible, by the way, through virtual means. Now we don't need to go and challenge the leadership of this country or that for campaigning. No, we can do it virtual, as we do now we can do many things through Zoom and through WebEx and all that. So a reasonable PNC with a reasonable leadership, which address the issue. Are we going to be still committed to the two-state solution, or are we going to go to one-state solution, or we should not talk about two states or one state? We should only struggle. And when the balance of power changes, then we could see what could come out. Once the balance of power changes, would it be, the outcome should be a one-state or two-state solution, two-state within two entities in one state, a federal government between the two groups, between Jewish and Palestinian population. Whatever comes, the outcome, we shouldn't debate it now. As they say in the Arabic, we should not fight over the skin of the bear before we hunt it. Why we have to fight now for one state or two state, when both are now, at this moment, impossible to achieve? Anyone who thinks there is a possibility of a two-state solution now is really out of touch and out of reality. The two-state solution has been buried long time ago by these extensive settlement activities, which started after Oslo, 10 times faster maybe than before Oslo.
Dr. Siyam, we have a question about the position of the other Arab countries with respect to the normalization between the UAE and Israel. The other Arab countries have been somewhat silent about it. Does that mean they are consenting and they'll be next, or what do you expect their position to be?
I don't think there will be any other country to go into full normalization before the elections in the US, except maybe Bahrain, maybe. And I really underline that. Because maybe Trump wants another gift from the Middle East because he has some difficulties at home. So he tried to bring every day something from the Middle East. Like 2 days ago, they said, oh, Serbia and Kosovo will move their embassies and open embassies in Jerusalem. So that is, so he might bring a small country like Bahrain. However, if Trump is re-elected, you will see more Arab countries going the same path like UAE, especially Sudan, Mauritania, maybe Oman. I still have some question mark about Oman because they have excellent relation with Iran. Why? They're not threatened by Iran. They're very close. Even the US asked Oman to interfere with the Iranians to release some of the Americans who were imprisoned in Iran. So, I mean, Morocco has some kind of contacts with Israel, so they might be encouraged if they see if they see Mauritania, and then Saudi Arabia. I think Saudi Arabia, in my opinion, will remain at least for a second stage when they see more. When they see Sudan, and they see Oman, Bahrain, other countries, they might still take that step. And it could be gradual, not one shot, okay? But from now until the elections in the US, to me, in my own analysis, I think maybe Bahrain, but not more than Bahrain, will go the same path.
Questions from a number of people is, what should the Palestinians do to deal with the current situation? What should the PLO leadership do?
As I mentioned, I mean, the most challenging now is to bring the Palestinians together. This is the most challenging. This division should end, and it's really a shame that the Palestinians, with all these challenges, they don't get together. We don't need to dissolve this faction or that. No, we need to agree on a program. The program which unites people, and not necessarily the ideology. You keep your ideology, I keep mine, but both we are challenged. I mean, the imminent danger is coming to both of us. So we should put our hands together. And now there is a chance, as we saw in those all speeches and meetings of Beirut and Ramallah, of the leaders of the factions. And if they're sincere about it, they should go for either creating a transitional government until the elections are conducted, or they go for elections. But or they could unite at one program and join all the factions together, including Hamas, including Jihad, including all these smaller factions, Popular Front, Democratic Front. They come with one faction and then bring it to the people. Because it's not the factions who will fight alone. It is the Palestinian people who are staying there and steadfast in their own land. I mean, peaceful resistance are more effective than throwing a rocket from here or there. I mean, the population in Palestinian proved time and again, they are willing to sacrifice, they're willing to stand. We saw that in First Intifada, the Second Intifada, the Aqsa uprising, the return marches from Gaza, all these forms of popular resistance. We should emphasize that. And the Palestinians are willing, but they have to see a truly committed, united leadership with one program. But if they see these factions, I think that will bring despair to the Palestinian people more than even before.
Dr. Siyam, question from a couple of people about what role do you expect China to play in the Middle East with respect to the Palestinian issue?
I have been following, I mean, the politics of China and Russia in the United Nations for so many years. I mean, they have some principled position, but they support the two-state solution. They give some aid to the Palestinians. They give them different kind of political, financial support. They invite many Palestinians to study in China. They give them aid, but that they don't go beyond that. I mean, Russia, for example, it has the warmest relation probably with Israel. I mean, Netanyahu was invited to Moscow more than invited to the White House. They have a strong relation. China will always repeat their position, but they don't go a step further. They don't, okay? They vote for every resolution on supporting the Palestinian right. They stand in every conference to support the Palestinian. But would they go further? I don't think so. I don't think so. And sometimes when you raise the issue with them, they say, why you don't unite? I myself ask Lavrov, why Russia stand in this position? Why you have so warm relation with Israel? And you keep a rhetoric of supporting the Palestinians. He said, we invited all the factions to Moscow several times to unite them, and we couldn't. So that is an argument that you lose when you raise it. So before we ask these countries to stand further and cement their support to the Palestinians should stand united. It's a precondition, in my opinion.
Another question that was posed, do you think there's a possibility of military action by Palestinians against Israel, or is that military action or armed struggle kind of past and outdated given the current situation?
I should not answer this question on behalf of the factions. I don't speak on behalf of any one of them, but I will say, I mean, resistance to occupation is something legitimate, and the resolution I referred to, 3236 of November 29, 1974, it states in Article 5 of that resolution clearly that the Palestinians are entitled to fight for their rights by all means. That's what it says, exactly word for word, by all means in conformity with the Charter, with the UN Charter. That is what it says. So that, which was, by the way, the same was used when Namibia was fighting the occupation of South Africa. So it was even cut and paste, because if they say, oh, we didn't have a precedent, they said, no, we do have a precedent. You have the same resolution in the case of Namibia. So Palestinians should decide on the means of resistance. I think these days, civil disobedience, civil resistance, peaceful resistance are more effective. I mean, the first intifada was far more effective than the second one. When the whole world see a people under occupation going into the street with their bare hands, going into strikes, going into marches without interfering, without using arms, I think that is very effective. However, if, I mean, Israel wants to use excessive force on the Palestinians, especially in Gaza, you can't tell them, oh, stay quiet, put your hands behind your back and let them kill you. And or respond to the Israeli occupation and siege and bombardment by just Dabka group and writing editorials. It doesn't work this way. It doesn't. So I am not the one who will tell the factions how to fight or the Palestinian people, but in my opinion, these days are for civil resistance. One day I gave an example to some people in Western Sahara, which is I was engaged with that. I mean, Amina to Haidar, she had a hunger strike in the airport of Las Palmas for 30 days. I mean, the whole world heard about her. And Hillary Clinton interfered on her behalf with the Moroccan authorities to allow her to go back to to Western Sahara. So civil disobedience, civil strife, civil resistance, I think, is very, very, very effective.
We have a question from a follower on Facebook. Do you think the response of the Palestinian armed factions of condemnation of the United Emirates move is appropriate, or should they take a more drastic response?
I think first, all Palestinian factions, including the official leadership, condemn this move because they consider that a stab in the back of the Palestinian people. As I said, because United Arab Emirates doesn't need that. It's not, they're not in an imminent danger that they need to throw themselves in the arm of Israel. That's one thing. The second, I think what the Palestinians need is to close these little gaps, which everyone, including UAE, criticizing. I mean, they become more effective if they speak with one voice, if they unite their ranks, if they come together. And that also will send an important message to others. I mean, if Bahrain sees that the Palestinians are standing firm, strong, with one voice, or Sudan, or any other country, they will probably hesitate. But I don't think the threats against any country will work now. To the contrary, they will give them more excuse to further themselves from the Palestinian cause. And I think the Palestinians should also, when they address this issue, differentiate between the leadership and the people, because there is a movement now in United Arab Emirates, and there is a statement came out with many prominent signatures who refusing this, who denying the right, the normalization, who said, no, we are committed to the Palestinian just cause. There are many prominent Emirates who signed this statement. So we have to be also careful not to annoy the ordinary people. Look at, for example, the mistake we paid for the 1991 war in Kuwait, when the late Yasser Arafat, he said, or he stated something was understood by the Kuwaitis, that he's standing with Saddam Hussein, who occupied their country. 400,000 Palestinians were thrown out of Kuwait. So we have to be careful with this kind of discourse. We have to be extremely careful to criticize and to focus our criticism on those political class rather than get it to the public and the ordinary people.
We have a question from John Lindner. John, would you like to ask your question? Go ahead.
Assuming that Biden is elected in November, and despite his current stand on Israel and Palestine, what should we be lobbying as friends of Palestinians for the Democrats to have as a policy? What's realistic? Most members of Congress are still stuck in a two-state solution rhetoric. What would your counsel be?
Thank you. It's a good question. I think the policies of Biden will not be the same like Trump. No one will be like Trump in reference to the support of Israel. No one.
Right.
No one will go and grant the Golan Heights to Israel. Who gave you the right to grant the Golan Heights or Jerusalem? Absolutely. Biden, in my opinion, as he said, I mean, I've been following his statement regarding the Middle East. First, he will restore the agreement with Iran. And that will calm the whole Middle East. Because once Trump withdrew from that agreement, it gave excuse to Iran to expand on its military activism, as you all know, especially in the field of missiles. So that is one important thing. The second, Biden promised that he will restore support of the Palestinians. He will open the office in Washington. He will not pull back the embassy from Jerusalem. That is, I think that's too much for him to handle. If he did, he will lose support from his political party. I think he will not be the same. I mean, the policies will not be the same. I don't think he will support the expansion of settlement activity. I don't think he will, let the peace process just dictated by one side, by Israel. We're not counting so much that he will force Israel on, let's say, annulling some of these decisions, especially the annexation. But when Israel find that there is no, the man in the White House is not a person who you tell him, do this and they will do, the way this case with Trump, they will think twice themselves. And some of the Israeli political class will tell their prime minister, don't ruin our relations with the US. It's very important. We cannot afford that. So I think with the election of Biden, I think things will be a little bit different. Yeah.
Samia Halabi has a question. Samia?
First of all, Dr. Siyam, I want to thank you. It's been great listening to you. You're very informed and you've put details into things we who listen and are not experts often glean from the little news we hear. And for me, I maybe sometimes go to extremes. It seems to me US interests, and again, I'll take your advice and separate between the US population and US intelligence services and leadership, and a US bourgeoisie who is divided right now, who has most of those Arab leaders under their control, including our Palestinian so-called our leaders, which to me, I no longer consider to be my leadership. So I ask you, with that much control and manipulation and puppeteering on the leadership of the various parties and on the Palestine Authority, how can our leadership come into unity? I do not see it as possible. I hope you have more hopeful insights. I see the people right now on the street being the real leaders of the Palestinian movement. I see sumud and resistance. I see it as being powerful. And my hope is in the people, all of them. In Gaza, the heroism is amazing. So I wonder how you would react to my insight about the impossibility or difficulty of unity among our so-called leadership.
Samia, you know, we both share same analysis of the leadership. I mean, we don't disagree on that. And we know that this leadership has been subject to so much pressure and alliance with the United States, and they've been dictating to them what to do and do this and do that, and they've been listening. But at the end, they came out empty-handed. They were, as somebody said, if Israel cannot do peace with Abu Mazen, with Abbas, it will never find anyone who is more lenient and more compromising leader like Abbas. Israel is not committed to any kind of peace. They want the land without the people. It's very simple. From day one they never change their program. Okay, what is the urgent issue now? That these even leadership, as much as they gave in, they are not even considered. No one is talking to them. So what is the solution? I don't see any hope. And I asked Saeb Erekat the other day in one of the Zoom lecture, I asked him, I said, do you think that the leadership which took the Palestinians to this abyss, to this kind of miseries, are qualified to lead them to victory? It doesn't make sense. So I think this leadership cannot navigate through a program of salvation. In my opinion, has to come from a grassroots. If they are concerned about the Palestinian, they should accept the free and fair elections now. And they should go for it and elect a new leadership. Maybe they will not say that, but the Palestinian people are fed up with that. Probably they could impose it from below. I mean, the Palestinian in Gaza, there is a movement, say, Bidna naish, we want to live, in a way of an outcry against the authoritarian regime of Hamas. Same thing in the West Bank. I go there at least 2-3 times a year to the West Bank. And I sit with people and I go to the refugee camps. I know how they feel. This leadership, if it is, to be left to the Palestinians to elect them or to go for elections, none of them will make it. None. They lost their touch with the public. They lost. I mean, they're trying to remedy themselves now under the slogan, we are standing against the bargain of the century, we're standing against the annexation, we're standing against the UAE agreement. But they're trying to mend their lost popularity, which is complete. So I believe, like you do believe, this leadership is not qualified, it has to come from below. And if they are really concerned about the Palestinian cause, they should allow the Palestinian to go into free and fair elections.
We have a question from Muhammad. Muhammad, you're unmuted. Please state your question.
Sure, thank you. Thank you very much for speaking today, and I really appreciate your salient point about collective solidarity to a common goal in Palestine, at least in the immediate term. But I'm just interested to hear about how you conceive of Palestinian unity. Is it through factional agreement and cohesion, or kind of along the lines of a decentralized grassroots movement like we saw in the first Intifada, especially since like the common refrain or charge was that the PLO was kind of representing the Palestinian movement almost externally and put things on the table that weren't on the table and kind of got terms that shouldn't have been there and whatnot. So really, what do you see as kind of that, what form do you see as possessing the most capability and potential for change, and also possessing that accountability mechanism to the Palestinian people as a whole? Thank you.
As you can see, most of the questions revolve around this issue of Palestinian division and how to do the Palestinian unity, which is a very difficult question and very difficult answer. And there is a group of Palestinian intellectuals called Palestine Forum. I am one of them. And we do a lot of brainstorming about what to do. And I wrote several articles in the paper with the title, What to Do. No one has the magic wand, you know. No one has the magic wand to make it. But what we see now, there is a challenge to the existence of the Palestinian cause, which that is reaches the leadership and every Palestinian anywhere in the world, what is being offered to the Palestinian is a complete annihilation. I mean, Danny Danon, the ambassador of Israel to the UN, who just finished his term and left, he wrote an article in July in the New York Times. Please look at it. It says, what's wrong with surrender? Exactly. That's what the Israelis are offering the Palestinians with the support of Trump. They're offering surrender. So why the Palestinians have to accept surrender? Let's assume there is faction of the leadership accept surrender. Maybe. I don't know. I cannot speak on behalf of the leadership. Maybe there is one in the probably security apparatus who could accept that, or could accept self-rule, or could accept to collaborate with Israel. But the Palestinian people will not accept it. I mean, in this year alone, 27 Palestinians were killed, an average of 3 a year. Last year, 2019, there is 15,000 and some hundreds of Palestinians were wounded during these marches. I mean, the Palestinians paid 265 martyrs during the Palestinian marches, which is called Marches of Return. I mean, from 2014 until now, the Palestinians paid over 5,000 victims, 5,000, which is an average of 465 martyrs every year. That means more than one a day. So why these have to be wasted? Why? I mean, who can dare to allow these martyrs to go in vain? Look at the prison. There's over 6,000 Palestinians in jail. There's over 300 under the age of 18. There are women in jail. There are children who go to martial court. It's the only place on earth there is a martial court for children, which is, by the way, the Israeli definition of a child, of a Palestinian child, is under 16, but an Israeli child is under 18. Okay, that is, it gives you an idea. So why any leader? I mean, the leadership are being now challenged. They are at the stake themselves. So either they live up to this challenge or leave, and we want them to leave, in fact. We don't trust that they will stand up to this challenge, okay? I mean, maybe some of them do. I don't want to generalize. Maybe there are some good leadership. I know some of the leadership in Ramallah who are not corrupt, who are really serious, and they want to mobilize the Palestinian people, but maybe they're not the sole legitimate, sole decision maker. Yeah, there are. But if the sword is coming to the necks of everyone, I mean, not one neck will be saved with this bargain of the century annexation and this kind of alliance between some Arab countries now, United States and Israel, to annihilate the Palestinian cause. Why they accept? It cannot work. I believe that, I mean, it's like the eruption of a volcano. There are so many natural elements will keep working under the surface, and at one point it will explode. And I think I can see it. The way the Arab Spring exploded unexpectedly in Tunisia, Egypt, Yemen, Syria, and others.
Nancy, you had one or two questions from Zoom, from the chat.
The first is my question, and then I'll ask a guest question from Zoom. Okay, Dr. Siyam, just to address semantics or the use of language a bit, and the history of normalization. Was the colonial apartheid structure since 1948, for 72 years now, the norm? Therefore, isn't the new proposal for an alliance with the UAE and other Arab countries a departure from the norm? And that's why I wonder about the use of the word normalization lately.
I said exactly the same. I mean, there was peace agreements between Egypt and Israel, but there was no normalization. What we're seeing now is something departure from that, because United Arab Emirates did not have like a kind of belligerency or state of war with Israel. It's only committed itself to the League of Arab States resolution, to the Arab Peace Initiative, to the UN resolution. I mean, the UN resolution, which is the United Arab Emirates, voted for every resolution that has deal with Palestine. So they're departing from their own culture, their own tradition, their own political discourse, from their own commitment, that is the new. I mean, Egypt signed a peace. I think Egyptian, the Camp David had changed the whole dynamics of the Middle East, as we know, and we could talk about it for a long time. I mean, especially after Egypt was spared any kind of conflict with Israel, and Israel felt their hands are free to bomb Iraq in 1981, to declare Jerusalem the capital, to annex the Golan Heights, all this because of Egypt. But there is no normalization between the Egyptian people and Israel. There's no normalization between the Jordanian people and Israel. This is something happening. The normalization will start and forming an alliance. So it's more than that, and we cannot accept that it's just merely because of the threat of Iran. This is not, to me, it doesn't make sense. They have a strong relation with Iran. And Iran has, by the way, the Shah of Iran occupied the 3 islands from United Arab Emirates, 1971. Exactly the same period when United Arab Emirates started to, about to declare its independence, a few days before or a few days after. UAE did not raise the issue of the 3 islands in the UN except 1981, the first time. They didn't mention them during the 70s when the Shah of Iran was there. And only after the Khomeini revolution and the war with Iraq started, 1980, then in 1981, the first time that the representative of the UAE mentioned these islands in a speech in the General Assembly. So that's why I don't see it as just it's a departure from everything, the UAE. It's not only a departure from what is the regular solidarity with the Palestinian, and we are sick and tired, and we want to live alone, and we want to. UAE has everything. It's a very rich country. They built a fairy tale city in Dubai. It's a virtual city that you cannot believe. They don't need to fight in Yemen. They don't need to send their troops to or recruit mercenaries from Sudan to send them to fight in Libya. Why? By the way, UAE has changed its position vis-a-vis the conflict in Syria. In 2015, MBZ convinced MBS, I hope you know these acronyms, that we should change course and we should support the regime of Assad. They went, both of them, to meet Putin in February 2015, and they convinced Russia to interfere on behalf of the Assad regime. And all that rhetoric was nonsense, that they are against it. They want dictatorship. Who said that UAE or Saudi Arabia don't want to see a dictator in Syria or in Libya? Why are they supporting Haftar? Why? A good question. Why they support? There is a civilian government which came out as an outcome of the Skhirat meeting in what's called the Libyan political program. And the UN, with the help of the international community, put a government, transitional government, civilian government, and so why they have to go to a renegade general and support it with millions of dollars? 100 flights came to east part of Libya between July 7 and 31st of August. 100 flights. The day where they were meeting in Berlin on 19 January, the day they were meeting to talk about Libya, 5 flights arrived the same day, and they were talking about we should condemn any intervention, we should stop all these kind of arming the parties and 5 flights, 4 of them from Russia and 1 from the United Arab Emirates to support Haftar. That is the situation. So Libya is playing a functional role for others, not for itself. They can live heavily, as they say, happily ever after. They have everything to live happily. Why they have to go to Asab in Eritrea, or to Hargeisa in Somalia, or to Socotra Island in Yemen? It's unbelievable.
Dr. Siyam, I think we're out of time. Before we close, Samia Halabi has something to say. Samia, you have the floor. You've got a couple of minutes.
Thank you so much, Dr. Siyam. I really appreciate the analysis and the knowledge you're giving us. I just wanted to say, and I'll be quick so you can comment, I don't think the Palestinians will be that easy to remove from the land. And I think the attempt to remove them is going to give Israel huge indigestion, a kind of indigestion that could bring it to an end. So I will end there. I really have faith in our ability to stay, to hold on, and that we're stronger in that respect. We're minus the arms, but we're stronger in that respect than they are by far.
Very strong. I think the Palestinians clinging to their land, nothing will remove them from their land. Look at what happened in Israel, inside Israel. 150,000 were left in 1948, and now they are over 2 million. They have 13 represented in the Knesset, and they are now being targeted because of the system of apartheid. It is the next probably uprising. It might happen, if not tomorrow, it will happen after tomorrow, among the Palestinians inside Israel. And there are so many supporters of their Jewish comrades also. So it's not only the Palestinian. I mean, the joint list has, I think they got 100,000 votes from Jews also. So Israel cannot continue like that. I mean, apartheid, occupation, and siege, and turning its back to the whole world community, to the UN resolution, to international legitimacy and international law forever, if they don't have a supporter in the White House. Thank you.
Great. I think this subject is so deep and complicated that 1 hour would not do it. So no. Hopefully we will have the opportunity to benefit from Dr. Siyam's knowledge and insights at a future episode of this program, and we would welcome him in the future to do that. I'd like to thank our audience on Zoom, our audience on Facebook, and the people who asked the questions. I'd like to thank Nancy Nesbitt, the curator of the Palestine Museum US. Thank Samia Halabi for her insightful remarks and for her artistic contribution to the Palestinian heritage. And finally, I'd like to thank Dr. Abdelhamid Siyam very much for taking the time and being with us today, and for supporting the Palestinian cause as well. And thanks to everybody. And as we say at the end of these programs, ma'as-salam.
Thank you so much, Faisal. If I have a minute to say, just thank you for your for organizing this talk. I really appreciate all those who came. Appreciate many of my friends. I see them there, from the UN journalist Rhonda, from Palestine, Muhammad Ouda, and others. Sami Halab is my lifelong friend, and Nancy, thank you so much. And I hope I was able to, you know, at least make some useful comments. Thank you so much.
More than that, more than that.
Yeah.
Great.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. Bye-bye.
Okay. Ma'as-salam.